Oh wait, no, she's not standing on the corpses. They're like part of her. Oh man, that's really the stuff of nightmares. That's like otherworldly. You need to get some psychiatric help. Hi there, my name's Guy, you're watching Midwinter Minis, and in this very special spooky episode, I'm going to be judging the mini painting subreddit's horror-themed painting competition. Two things before we begin. First off, I am almost completely blind without my glasses, so I'm going to be putting those on before we start. And second, I am partially red-green colorblind, so if I make any comments about the colors of things that you go, hang on a second, that's totally wrong, that's probably the reason why. Okay, let's get stuck in, shall we? Ah, so much better. Also, third thing, I have the very appropriate drink to accompany me. So each paint job in this competition will get a score out of 10 for 3 different criteria. These are composition, execution, and palette. For composition, we're talking about what your eye sees first and how focused the arrangement of all the elements is. Basing and the story it tells also factor in here. For execution, we're concerned with the technicality of how well it was painted, the techniques used, the attention to detail, the quality of the scratch-built elements, stuff like that. And for palette, I'm going to be judging the colours used, how well they work in the context of the model and the spooky theme, as well as the contrast they add to the model itself. And then I'm going to add those all together and summarise with a mark out of 30. Even though the organiser of this painting competition has very, very kindly given me a first couple of pages that show me all of the models that have been submitted, just so I can kind of get a good baseline for a minimum score, I'm going to kind of ignore that because I want to show you my honest reactions to seeing these paint jobs for the first time. I don't want any kind of spoilers because I think that would be more interesting for you to watch as well as for me to do. So we're starting off with the beginner single figure / small format category. Okay, are you ready? Let's go. Okay, number 1 by Affectionate Rush 58. This is a fantastic little ghoul monster thing in a lovely cape. Mr. Scully Boy, he's got a bag of bones, he's got pumpkins, he's got a little lantern and a gravestone. This is absolutely beautiful. That composition, the composition of the miniature is lovely. It's very pleasing to look at. You are kind of drawn to that weird bony face with its peculiar eyes. I love it. I'm going to give that 6. Pretty good. Execution, I would say, all in all, it looks very, very nice. The gravestone looks great. One thing that could maybe be improved is the ground looks a little bit kind of obviously basing material. That's not to say that's terrible. It's a product because it's good. I'm going to say 5 for execution. Kind of go middling on that because I always want to, give myself room to go up or down. The color palette though, that is absolutely beautiful. Classic Halloween spooky colors of orange and purple. So I'm going to give that, let's say a 7. That's pretty tasty indeed. Ah, now look at this. A bottle mimic by Rust Jesus. That is sensational. By looking at the extra pictures, you can see that behind its back it is holding an X-Acto blade and it's just hiding in amongst all the paint bottles. Outstanding. In terms of composition, I think I've got to give that like a 7 or an 8. It's such a cool little idea. The one thing that maybe kind of lets it down slightly is the rushed paint job on the face of it, particularly. The kind of colours are just blobbed on a little bit haphazardly, especially on the brow. So I'll give that a 4. A 5? A 4. I'm wearing corpse paint, I've got to be mean, right? In terms of colour palette though, it's gorgeous. Those eyes really pop out against the rest of it. So I'm going to say a healthy 6. Look at this beautiful character from Drab Brab. It's quite gross actually, the more you look at it. There's a big pile of bodies underneath her. She's holding up a kind of gruesome severed corpse on her talon. Ugh, I love it. There's some nice sculpting work on the background. That big pool of oozy blood is really shiny and gross. That is quite spectacular. Oh wait, no, she's not standing on the corpses. They're like part of her. She's in them. They're crawling under her. That is some imagination you have there. Okay, in terms of composition, I'm gonna have to give that a 7. I think that's quite beautiful indeed. In a disgusting way, but that's what we're here for, right? Again, in terms of execution, there's some things that are amazing, and there's some things that kind of let it down a little bit. For example, the actual application of the paint on the dress and the fabric is a little bit chunky, which is always the danger when you're kind of painting a lighter colour. I'd have liked to see that a bit smoother, but the skin of all of the corpses is really nicely rendered. There are some good things, some bad things, so I'm going to give that a 5. And the color palette, we've got this really nice sort of bluey purples of the tentacles contrasting against that really warm tone of the reds and the kind of gore underneath, split down the middle with that nice, very light colored dress. I think in terms of the palette, it's very nice, so I'm going to give that a 7. Ooh, what is this disgusting bony monster thing from Skluks 3470? Ugh, twin-headed bony demon thing. Grim. I tell you what it reminds me of, and I know I feel like I bring up the Guyver way too often, but right at the very start of it there is an experimental zoonoid, kind of human that turns into a monster, that's not quite complete and he's all sort of muscle and bones exposed, called Malmut. And he totally reminds me of that. I'll show you a picture of it on the screen right now. What do you think? Anyway, so this is called The Butcher, and I think it looks pretty ridiculously good. I don't really want to penalize it because it's quite a simple color palette, because it works, but to be honest, for the composition, I don't really have much to say. It works, but it's not really blowing me away, so maybe I've got to give that a 4, to be honest. It's quite simple, but it is great. But yeah, I'm going to say a 4. In terms of execution, it is pretty well rendered. The sort of muscle fibers are believable, the bone is believable, maybe it could be a little bit smoother in some places, or it maybe could have had a little bit more warmth or richness kind of put into the bones, or maybe there could have been some interesting light play. So I think the execution, maybe a 4 or a 5. I'll go for 4. Everyone said I was too kind in the last video when I did this, so I'm going to say 4. And in terms of color palettes, I know this is going to sound mean, but I'm going to say 3. It's quite basic, and it's quite washed out. And maybe something like that shouldn't necessarily leap out at you, but with my particular weird color blindness, very subtle reds look quite grey, so this whole thing looks very, very grey to me. Just for me, I'm going to give that a 3. I'm very sorry, Skluks, because I actually like it. Okay, Crodhouse has presented us with a pretty spooky looking ghost knight. He's kind of wisping around, floating over the base. It's very nice. I really like the kind of swampy, spooky, murky mire that he is floating over, and the little undead warrior who's popping out to say hello. In terms of composition, I think I'm going to give that a 5. There is some quite nice object source lighting coming from that green illuminated thing at his waist. That is quite tasty. The rest of it though looks just a little bit plain, particularly the metallics on the armor. I'm a fan of true metallic metal, but you can kind of work more highlights and more shadow and kind of more depth and contrast into those areas. And that's kind of what I'd have liked to see here really. So I think for execution, don't hate me, gonna have to give it a 4. As I said, I really like those greens. To me, to my eyes, there isn't sort of much more to contrast that. And sometimes you don't need to contrast that if those have been rendered spectacularly, but the armor doesn't really blow me away and it doesn't kind of contrast enough to make that green really pop, which is a shame because I can see a lot of potential there. But to be honest, I think, again, it's got to be either a 3 or a 4. I'm going to say 3. Okay, I know you might feel I'm being a little bit harsh here, but the last time I did a paint judging video, I was dishing out 8s and 9s in the beginner category, and then I ran out of room to go higher later on. So, with that in mind, let's start the beginner multiple figures / large format category. Necromagic by ToneTone89. This is really nice. So we've got a gruesome looking vampire necromancer-y kind of guy, and he is summoning the undead from this small body of water lying in front of him, but also under the ground. Very gruesome indeed. Very cool mini diorama. I like it a lot. I really enjoy the composition, and I like that the kind of vampire model is at the top of the hill on the slope down to the water. It really kind of keeps the focus on him. But there's all these other lovely little details that really reward a longer, more intense inspection of the model. One thing I don't like as much about it, and this is generally about most dioramas, is the kind of forced tapering off of the landscape that's been created for the diorama. I know that's not really the focus, but when you look at the sides, it kind of looks like a really weird, steep cliff, but it's still treated in the same way with the kind of foliage that you see on the top as well. That being said, that is a little bit nitpicky, I get that, but I am judging here, that's what I'm supposed to be doing. To be honest, I think there's enough interesting things to look at in there, nicely arranged, that I can kind of let that pass a little bit. So I'm going to give that an 8 for composition. In terms of execution, in terms of the paint job on the models, it is really nice. There's some very nice popping areas. There's lots of light and dark and contrast, even though, you know, it's a dark, kind of spooky themed model. there's still some light elements to it, which makes it interesting for the eye. There's also some pretty nice shallow water on the edge of a very, very thin base. How do you achieve such wizardry? For execution, I'm going to say a solid 6. I was tempted to go 7, but I'm going to try and keep a level head here. A level head wearing corpse paint. And for the color palette, again, we have that classic kind of bluey midnight purple contrasting against the green that screams macabre Halloween fun times. The only thing that's missing is a little orange pumpkin. I'm going to give that color palette a 7. Look at this. Unwanted Reflections by Holy Wook. We've got the classic haunted house scene of looking into a mirror and seeing a ghostly reflection. I think it's quite deceptively simple looking at it. There has been a lot of thought gone into this. The fact that the lighting is shifted in opposite planes on each side of the mirror is really, really intense, and it's a really nice thing to look at. So you've obviously got the one lady holding the candelabra being illuminated from that, and you've got all the kind of cooler colors on the bottom and the warmer colors on the top. And then on the other side, you've got a shifted color palette for sure, but it's being lit from below. So you've got that spooky floor lighting going on, and all of the cool colors are on top, kind of, you know, illuminated by moonlight or something. It looks very, very spooky indeed, and it looks really, really cool. I like it. In terms of composition, as I said, it's very, very simple, but it's very effective. I'm going to give that an 8. And for the execution, to be honest, I've got to go for an 8 as well. I can't really think of too many more things that I would want to add to that. It's just a very nice, simple piece. It's very well thought out and very well executed. Yeah, a solid 8. And for the color palette, as I mentioned, it's very, very cleverly done. There's some really, really nice tonal shifting from the warm candelabra to the kind of cold clothes underneath. And then, as opposed to the orangey candlelight in the reflected version, it is illuminated with green. It is a nice contrast, and I think it works really well. So I'm going to give the palette an 8 as well. 8 across the board. Little Reef of Horrors by Thplicata. Oh, that is really the stuff of nightmares. That is horrible. So obviously we've got this disgusting shell snail monster lady who is, you know, crawling across the reef, hunting down various aquatic life that has human faces. It's pretty horrible. It definitely is that thing that you would describe a nightmare to someone and they'd be like, you need to get some psychiatric help. The kind of rocks and coral are really nice. I don't know if they're real coral. I don't think so. That's illegal now, isn't it? But yeah, there's loads of lovely little details. I'm really enjoying zooming in and looking at all these photos. And to top it all off, they have used fluorescent paints. So if you look at it under a black light, some of the elements, like the little frilly edges of the snails, really pop out. That's quite spectacular. Okay, I'm going to give the composition a 7. Even though it's very, very detailed, it's quite busy to the eye. I maybe have dialed back a little bit on some of the kind of rocks and strewn elements because it's sometimes a little bit confusing what you're supposed to be looking at, which is a shame because the things that are there to look at are amazing. And on the execution, again, I think the inclusion of those fluorescent paints really makes it pop. It's obviously difficult to see that in photos because the way cameras work, you can't quite see it. It's much more obvious with the naked eye. So I'm not going to kind of judge it down on that. Not just the color choice, but everything about that kind of weird, creepy snail monster is quite nightmarish. So I think in terms of execution, of delivering on their idea, I'm going to give that a 7. And for the color palette, I'm tempted to go for an 8, but then I'm remembering I just gave an 8 for that Unwanted Reflections thing, and I think there could have maybe been more color focus on this. It is very, very good. I'm finding those kind of rocks and the colors of the rocks around the models quite distracting. So I'm going to go for a 7. Very almost an 8, but not this time. I'm sorry. Return to Bald Mountain by Brentoxor. This looks insanely huge. Really amazing red lighting there on the wings. Is that actual lighting or has that been painted on? Hold on a second. Nah, you're trying to fool me with creative lighting. I see you. I see you, Brentoxor. Sneaky lighting aside, it is a really, really cool looking diorama though. Aside from the huge demon, who, you know, looks super impressive, there's so many little minion dudes around him. Gargoyles and undead warriors. A really interesting piece. It's quite confusing to look at first glance. The paint jobs on the little kind of side characters are actually really, really nice. I kind of prefer the details on those to the larger model. I know it's kind of supposed to look like a big stony gargoyle dragon knight thing, but the best part of this model is actually the kind of smaller dudes around the outskirts. In terms of composition, it's very, very striking and it's very impressive, but it is quite busy. It's almost too busy with those little guys around his feet. So I'm going to maybe give that a 6. In terms of execution, you can see there's a huge amount of work gone into this in every photo. The rocky base could have maybe been rendered slightly differently to kind of bring out those models. The sharp edges and the contrast of that also do their part in maybe obscuring what you're actually looking at. But then again, it is very visually impressive, so I'm going to give that a 6. In terms of color palette here though, there is a lot on offer. The problem is though, when you take away that red backlight, it drops away quite significantly. And maybe it's just because I've seen it with the red light. When you take it away, it kind of looks disappointing. I would always recommend, if you're considering submitting a photo of a paint job, just to kind of keep the lighting as neutral as possible, because otherwise you kind of mess with people's expectations slightly. You know, I do that as well. I use cool lighting in some of the shots in my videos, but I always try and show very boring neutral lighting for the majority of it, just so you get an idea of what the models actually look like. I'm going to say color palette of 7, because I've looked at all of the little minions in close-up detail, and there's some really, really nice paint jobs, and they work quite well together thematically. So yeah, a 7. Ooh, tasty little diorama from Julhik. So we've got a big rampaging top-heavy monster covered in armor plates and huge spikes and loads of corpses, terrorizing a frail old woman in a sewer. It's just like being in Edinburgh again. One thing I really like about this is its arrangement. It's kind of off-center, and I don't know whether or not this was intentional, but having that curve there really makes you kind of look up to the model. You suddenly also realize how big it is in comparison to the frail old woman that it's terrorizing. So I'd say in terms of composition, I'm going to give that a 9. It's very pleasing to the eye, even though the subject is, you know, kind of terrifying. For the execution, I feel like it's a little bit too bright. But then I'm looking at the photos and I see there is a reference paint of German grey, it looks like, next to it. And German grey is incredibly dark. So I think these shots have been overlit, which is always a danger, especially when, you know, you're having to take your own photos of your models that you're presenting and you're not kind of giving them to a company that's taking photos of everything in the same context. I was going to say it kind of looks a little bit washed out and a little bit pale, but I think I'm getting a false sense of that here. There are some really interesting color choices, you know, the pinky purple of the dress and the greeny sludge of the sewer pipe. That's, you know, as I've said previously, that's classic Halloween colors. You could have maybe done some sort of dramatic lighting, but you don't necessarily need it. This still looks good. Personally, I maybe would have added a little bit more kind of weathering and grungy elements to the disgusting armor that the monster is wearing. But apart from that, I would say the execution is pretty well done. I'm going to give that a 7. And yeah, for the color palette, as I said, I feel like I'm getting a false impression that it's washed out, but it's hard to know, so I'm going to give that 5, playing it safe. Okay, I think we're about halfway now, so before we jump into the intermediate single figure / small format category, I'd like to very quickly talk to you about brand new Midwinter Minis t-shirts, themed with a black metal logo. As I said in a few previous videos, I'm a big black metal fan, and not just the music, I'm also very into the aesthetic. And I thought it would be cool to have the Midwinter Minis logo reimagined as a black metal band logo. And to do that, I asked the best of the best, the Lord of Logos, Christoph Speidel, to design that new logo. And here it is. If you want a t-shirt or a hoodie with this logo on, you can follow the link in the description, and we're taking pre-orders right now. To be honest, I get that it's a totally niche thing. We're probably not going to make a huge amount of these t-shirts, so if you want one, grab one now, because I don't think they'll be around for a very long time. Okay, here we go. Intermediate. Look at this little spooky dude riding a pumpkin driven by cats. I love it. Beatrix the Witch Queen by P101. I think I'm in love. Look at that. It's so nice. Very cartoonish, but it's absolutely gorgeous. Look at the little face. Not only is it adorable, the colors are great. It's explosively vibrant, which is a really refreshing change to some of the previous models, which, you know, they were going for the macabre dark look, and this is very much not doing that. In terms of composition, it's absolutely stunning to look at. It really works well as a model. Very, very cute, but it also is just really charming in lots of ways. I'm going to give that an 8. For the execution, one of the things I like most about it is there is a lot of different painting techniques being used here. There's some kind of non-metallic metal elements on the little trinket on the hat and also the staff. The paint application on the pumpkin is very, very smooth. You can't really see any of the paintbrush strokes, but on the hat, for example, there's some kind of stippling, which sort of hints at the fabric and how that is a different material from the pumpkin. The cat's fur is actually rendered simply but effectively in a cartoon style. It gives the impression of texture, which is really, really nice. So there's a lot going on here beyond just the composition and the colors. So I'm going to give that an 8, I think. And yeah, the palette, again, it's that classic kind of green, midnight purples and orange, but there is a tiny red toadstool on the base. So I think where I've given it sort of 6 or 7 in the past, I'm going to give it another solid 8. So that, again, is an 8 all round. Ah yes, Gorslav, the Gravekeeper from Cursed City, if I'm not mistaken. And this has been painted by Soli Booley. Even though it's quite a simple paint job, it's very striking and it works very well on quite a few different levels, even down to the basic stuff like the spade. You know, the grave digging spade. Some kind of like fresh metal along the edge where, you know, obviously he's been digging those graves, and then, you know, the rest of it has kind of got mud and rust and dirt on it, and it looks like it's a well-used implement by some ageless horror, which is exactly what we're doing here. The skin looks pallid and gross but dirty, but there is some really, really nice highlighting and shading on that fabric too. The base is simple, but it works really nicely with the model, and you got to remember this thing is quite small. I'm going to give the composition a 7. In terms of execution, which is obviously quite fitting for this model, can't really see many areas that I would like to see change dramatically. Maybe a tiny bit of a brighter highlight on the fabric, maybe just to add a little bit of kind of scratchy textures, because at the moment it looks like very smooth, shiny silken fabric, and I doubt something that horrific would be wearing something like that. So I'm going to be fair and say, you know, a 7 for execution. Pretty good. And then for the palette, it is simple, intentionally simple. You know, you're only talking about skin, bone, fabric, and some kind of mottled, murky earth. We're not really going to hold the required simplicity of that color scheme against it in terms of the palettes. I think it works really well. I think it's effective, and that's really what counts, I suppose. So let's give that a 7. Whoa mama, would you look at this? A very, very spooky Ghost Queen thing. I'm not really up to date on the Age of Sigmar model range, so I don't know its official name, but man, it looks awesome. This has been painted by Zindalore, and I've got to say they've done a spectacular job. It looks really, really beautiful. In terms of composition, your eye is immediately drawn to that very, very spooky skull hidden beneath the veil, rendered with just enough detail that you can definitely make out that there's a skull under there, not a nice human face. Very macabre indeed. And the fact that the lightest colours, not just in terms of the skull and the fabric, but also the kind of crowning of that gold element is really, really, you know, striking to look at, especially on a black background. It pops so, so beautifully well. I'm going to say composition, 8. For the execution, there are obviously some absolutely beautiful color transitions, especially on the fabric. Don't overlook the things like the kind of wispy hair on their little sidekicks at the side, the very, very smooth skin, and again, that really, really intensely bright metallic elements that really draw your eye upwards. And the base is, you know, as you'd expect, is kind of necessarily quite drab and dark looking, because you don't want to distract away from that amazing, very vibrant top of the model. One thing though, I would be absolutely terrified to pick that model up is, you know, everything is balanced on that tiny little wisp of fabric at the bottom. So I'm going to say execution of 8. I like it a lot. For the color palette, you know, there's that kind of like turquoisey blue element, but also there are a couple of little touches, especially on the flowers, those kind of like little rosy pink flowers. I would have maybe liked to see something else though, because it's all in that very sort of bluey, greeny spectrum. But having said that, there's not many other elements actually on this model. It's very simple, and I think that's kind of its strength. So I'm not going to hold that too much against it. I'm going to choose 7. Ooh, that is nasty. I love it. And this particularly nasty monster has been painted by Cup626 Cake. And they have done a spectacular job, I've got to say. It looks really, really great. Not just in terms of the paint job as well, which is, you know, simple, but it's very, very effective, but also in terms of the composition, making it a believable environment for this thing to be in. And it looks quite spooky. Eyeless face is really freaking me out, actually. And it's really small. Just looking at this next to a paint bottle, and it's a tiny little thing. The kind of green lavery ooze stuff that's seeping along the ground is maybe a little bit too bright and distracting, because the model itself is really, really impressive, but your eye is sort of almost naturally drawn downwards towards the base, which is a bit of a shame. It does help that they've used that then to give the sort of green hue as an uplight to the model, but maybe that could have been made a little bit stronger to kind of really emphasize the model itself rather than the base it's on. So annoyingly, I think I've got to give the composition a slightly lower mark than the previous one, so I'm going to give that a 6. That being said, the execution of all of those things is really, really terrifyingly good. The color palette of basically only being illuminated by that glowing ooze works really, really well. It's a very spooky, effective color scheme, and it's kind of cinematic in its way. Really, really good. I really like it. I'm going to give it an 8. So trying to decide what to score it for the palette, but one thing that could have maybe just raised it a little bit higher to the next level, if you will, if you want to use that stupid phrasing, is you could have maybe just introduced some more cooler colors on the top facing parts of things that aren't being illuminated by that sort of green from below. A nice bit of color play that would have been quite striking and maybe might have drawn attention to the underside of the model a little bit more. Give it that uplit look. That's not to say it's bad, and I think it looks really, really good, so I'm going to give that a 6, maybe a 7. Let's say a 7. I'm trying really, really hard not to scratch myself with my fingers, so I'm using a little scratchy stick. Ugh. So here we have Ebrietas, Daughter of the Cosmos, by Bondafong. Amazing. This is really, really sensational. The more you look at it, the more you kind of just get sucked into that really grotesque ball in the middle. I think of all the models that I've seen ever, actually, this one kind of encapsulates that unknowable cosmic horror, that real Lovecraftian vibe very well. You're not really sure what you're looking at. There's kind of wings, there's kind of tentacles. It's very, very dreamlike in a way. There's, a big disgusting brain, but it kind of looks like a mollusk of some kind. Spectacular. In terms of composition, I'm going to give that a very healthy 9. I think it is very, very good indeed. In terms of execution, I think, as I said, it's done incredibly well in that it really does kind of suck your attention right towards the center. Inescapable gaze, almost. It's really, really intense to look at, especially on a black background. I've got to give that an 8 or a 9. It's really, really impressive. Even though I'm tempted to hit the 9 there, I'm going to say 8 because I feel like a couple of the colors, especially towards the center, could have maybe been a little bit more saturated, and that again would have really reinforced that attention-sucking nature where it instantly draws your eye to the middle. Could have been a little bit more intense in the middle, but I think the color choice and the palette work really, really well, even if a lot of those colors are very kind of dark, muted grays. So I'm going to say 8 for that. Okay, next is the intermediate multiple figures / large format category. Can't wait. Oh man, that's really the stuff of nightmares. That's like otherworldly. This monstrosity is by OSW Zengiki. Ah, no, what's this on the base? A dismembered dog. As soon as you get sad dogs involved, you're instantly losing points in my book. But the composition, man, works so well. It's so vibrant on the eye, almost hypnotic, that horrible face thing, and the really kind of enticing / disgusting Giga-esque body that is going on there as well. It's quite an intense model. I'm going to give that an 8. Oh wait, it's got hooves. It's not a dog. It's just a deer. Take back everything I said. I don't care about deer. Bambi, come at me, bro. In terms of the execution, one thing that is maybe slightly confusing about it is the base. Just glancing at it and the color palette used, the patterns and textures used, you might assume it's kind of a watery theme, but I think it's obviously like Stranger Things inspired, that upside down. It's definitely that kind of vibe going on there. So maybe that could have been clearer with the kind of creation of the base, aside from any initial confusion. And confusion in this case is probably actually quite a good thing because it's a weird thing to look at and it's very, very creepy and distorted and gross, which is perfect for this painting competition, right? It's totally thematic and it's done really, really well. I'm going to give the execution, let's say a 9. For the color palette, there's some really, really nice choices here. There's that kind of really pale, ghostly blue, but there are some nice kind of color transitions in there down to the bottom of the legs. There's the kind of warm, butchered livestock on the ground, and they're really wet, gaping, gross mouth thing. Sounds really horrible when you say it out loud. It's disgusting to look at, but that's what we're looking for here. So I'm going to give that a 9. Next up, we have Welcome to the Puppet Show by KR Sparkles. So this is almost kind of the opposite of the comments that I was giving to the Bear Mountain model that we saw previously. It's very, very visually impressive and it's very colourful, but I feel like it kind of loses focus because it's maybe a little bit too simple in terms of the actual staging of the diorama. The models themselves are very, very detailed, even though the paint jobs are, quite simple on them, especially the little minions. But the thing I feel that lets it down is the actual stage itself looks a little bit too amateurish. It's quite kind of roughly finished, which is a shame because the rest of the models look really, really good. So even though it's an interesting visual composition, it instantly doesn't look quite as professional as I think it maybe should be in this category. So I'm going to give that a 4. For execution, there are some really, really nice points that kind of unfortunately do contrast against the quite basic elements that this model has. The top of the Puppet Master's cape, for example, is really, really nicely painted in that sort of pinky, purpley hue. And it feels like quite a deliberate color choice across the model. Everything is quite disparate, but it works together. Also, when you look at it from the top-down angle, you can see that there's the, effect of a spotlight being cast down on the Puppet Master himself, which is very, very cool. So I think giving it a 5 for execution is pretty fair. But then again, you do, as I said, have to contrast the quite nice elements with the things that make it look quite amateurish, like the uneven application of whatever material that is at the front of the stage, the textures from the sculpting that you can still see in that. Just a little bit more time finishing would have, I think, really raised this to the next level. Moving on to the color palette though, I think it works really well. It does have that kind of playful look to it, not sort of falling into the trap of making everything look dark and dingy, even though in a cinematic universe it probably would be. So I'm going to give that a 6. The Zombie Queen by Adobo Paint Studio. This is really, really nice. It works really well against a dark background because it has that kind of very moody, broody lighting going on. We've got the Zombie Queen swooping forward with all of her undead minions rising up behind her. I think the composition's great. The one thing that maybe works against it slightly in terms of composition is the Gravedigger at the back. He's maybe just a little bit kind of too high up or a little bit overlit in terms of the paints that are used and the brightness that's been used to render him. It's slightly distracting, which is a shame because the rest of the model is fantastic. So I'm going to give the composition a 7, but I think that's where the comparatively low marks end because I think the execution of this is spectacular. I really like the kind of retro style green zombies, the proper old horror flick vibes. It's a very believable setting, even though it's obviously very campy and doomy and gloomy. I'm going to give the execution an 8. The tricky thing here now is where we look at color palette because for my eyes, it's just not very interesting. Again, as I said at the start of the video, I'm kind of partially red-green colorblind, so the fact that there's greens and reds interplaying here, it just doesn't work for my eyes. With that in mind, unfortunately, if you're painting for your audience, I can see that it's well done, but it's just difficult for me to kind of pass what's going on, so I'm going to give that a 5. But there's a 9 in 10 chance that you've got totally, perfectly working normal eyes. So what would you have given this out of 10 for palette? Let me know in the comments. Ah, look at this absolutely beautiful model by Danjufo LPM. Just looking at this objectively, the composition is absolutely outstanding. It's such a believable little setting and everything is being illuminated by that little fire. You've got I assume it's some kind of necromancer getting a zombie out of the ground. Maybe there's a deeper story here that I'm missing, but it looks really, really beautiful. It's painted beautifully, spooky statue in the background overlooking everything, but giving, the composition height and focus as well, because you're using the cooler colors at the top and the warmer colors at the bottom, so your eye is going to be sort of drawn down to that fire where you're actually seeing the characters. I'm going to give the composition a 9. I really, really like that. I think it's very effective. For execution, again, I think I've probably got to go for a 9. Object source lighting from that fire is just absolutely beautiful. The fact that the actual fire pit itself is casting a shadow underneath the flame is really nice. One thing that I would have quite liked to see is maybe just a little bit of that firelight being shown on the front of the statue as well, and it not be almost totally one uniform color. Although beautifully rendered, it almost feels like it's maybe not part of that scene, which is a shame really, because it's so beautifully done otherwise. So I'm going to give that a 7. But then leading on from that, the color palette I think is exceptional. Everything is basically only lit by that fire, so all of the things that can be, illuminated in that warm tones that you get from firelight have been, and everything else is kind of cast in that very cold moonlight. I think it works brilliantly. I'm going to give the palette a 9. They're Just Stories, right? By MTech Studios. This is a really interesting little composition, I suppose. It's hard to know what's going on here. The models themselves are quite interesting, but it's kind of laid amongst this. I don't know really what it's supposed to be. Is it like a kind of foggy cloud or mist? It's a little bit unclear. I'm not sure what I'm seeing here, and I'm not sure if I like it, to be honest. It's a very spooky looking thing, but as I said, it's quite confusing, so I'm not really sure what to give it for composition. It's that sort of like the ghostly dream state thing, but for me it kind of almost looks like that fuzzy stuff isn't part of the diorama, and maybe it shouldn't have been. It might seem harsh, but I'm going to have to give the composition a 5. For the execution, this is going to be tricky again, because there's some things I really like about it. I really like the fabric and the cloak. I really like the girl's hair, and the kind of color choice is really, really interesting as well. But I think it's just a little bit sort of too dark and confusing, especially sort of set against that confusing background already. So I'm going to give the execution a 5 as well. Might seem harsh, but again, I'm trying to keep the categories in mind when I'm marking these. But as I said before, I do enjoy the color palette. I'm going to give that a 7. Okay, are you sitting comfortably? We are about to enter the advanced category. Naha! I'd recognize Miniax Duchess anywhere. This one has been painted by Rahenya, and I've got to say, they have done a pristine job. This looks outstanding. Compositionally, having her on that kind of raised plinth I think works really well, especially that the width of it matches her base beautifully. Man, I could talk about this for hours. There is so much going on and so much that kind of needs to be addressed. Every ripple of the fabric has been beautifully, beautifully rendered. The brightness of the face and the kind of the dark dinginess of the base really draws your eye up towards her face. Her face has been absolutely beautifully painted. There's like filigree on her fabric. All of the metals have been rendered in non-metallic metal, which, isn't my preferred choice of metallic, but for this kind of painting, it works so, so beautifully. The stonework on the base and the moss is just really, really lovely, very believable, and as a bonus, there is a distracted familiar, a cute little cat playing with her tassels. Very cute, very impressive. I'm going to give the composition a 10 here. I'm not sure how you could improve on this. I certainly have no ideas, so I think that's only fair. Execution, I think I've got to just echo the comment I made. I've looked all around this model and I can't see anywhere where I think, oh, that could have been done better. So what else can you give it but 10? And for the color palette, it's absolutely beautiful. There's some really, really gorgeous tones with the sort of blues and the purples kind of flowing into each other. And the really beautifully warm hair color accents all of those things really nicely as well. Is this going to be a 10 all round? It might have to be. It's happening. 10. What is this monstrosity by M.W. Heth? Some kind of spooky shaman? No, it's not a shaman. There's no human face in there. It's just a demon. I think this is that kind of weird blurry line between miniature painting and sculpture art, because this is an absolutely beautiful piece of art, that you would have on a shelf or on your mantelpiece. It's really interesting to look at and it's really striking, but I wouldn't necessarily call this a miniature, strictly speaking, So we've got to remember we're looking at this in terms of composition, execution, and palette. I think in terms of composition, it's very, very high scoring. It's very striking to look at, kind of everything working in that column, but the model itself kind of breaking out of it. It's very dynamic. The only thing that, if I'm being really nitpicky, that I don't quite like about the composition, or maybe actually this is the execution, is that some of the sticks look a little bit like they're just stuck sticks, rather than kind of integrated into the model in a kind of flowing way. But really, that's being nitpicky. That's kind of the only thing I can find fault with. So I'm going to give this model a 9 for composition and a 9 for execution. But I think the color palette choice here is absolutely sensational. I'm going to give it a very healthy 10. I just love the kind of moonlit look, but also with that warm vibrancy on the front-facing part of the model itself. It really is very striking, and it works very well in the theme of the competition too. Little Cheeky Chucky by In the Heat of Lisbon. This is absolutely beautiful, to be honest. The whole setting of the diorama is really, really spectacular. The boards and the setting of the model have been scratch built. All of the floorboards look like they've actually been cut and placed and painted. It looks very believable. The model of Chucky itself looks like a freeze frame from a film. It's just absolutely spectacularly done. In terms of composition, it's very arty, it's very cinematic. I'm gonna give that a 10. It's excellent. And I'm also going to give a 10 to palettes because honestly I can't really think of how else you would enhance that with color. But I am going to have to dock a single point from execution, and that is because when you take a look at the back of the model, the back of the hair looks a little bit too plain. It looks like it's not had the same care and attention applied to it as the rest of the model, which is a bit of a shame because the front is very, very striking, but the hair at the back of the head, I feel like it just needs a few more highlights or a little bit more shading, something just to bring it out a little bit more, because unfortunately it just looks a little bit too plain. Advanced entry number 4, Theatre of Madness by CZI. Insanely good. And it's tiny as well, looking at it next to these paint bottles. Wow. Look at these sad, sad puppets. One has died, one is crying. Evil little minions and marionettes are gazing out from their scary box. And the colours are just absolutely mind-blowing. Totally beautiful. The kind of warm sepia tone of the internal element going on here really looks like a kind of a vintage film, you know, a very old horror film. Whereas the outside of the clothing just is an explosion of this blue colour, and the contrast between those two elements is just so intense. In terms of composition, it's got to be a 10. In terms of execution, I can't really see that much that could be improved. Everything looks spectacular. The texture of all the fabrics, not just on the main model, but also on the little marionettes, is just so intense. Everything is so beautifully captured. Every photo of this looks like a gorgeous film still. Weird freehand faces of screaming horror on the back of the cloak. Insane. Absolutely insane. I've got to give this a 10. Let's face it, I'm going to give this a 10 all round. I know I've just done that on a previous model, but, you know, somebody else can decide who is best between those two. I'm not the only judge, but I think these two are equally deserving of full marks. Outstanding. And here we have The Pit by Grogus. This is a really amazing bust diorama going on here. We've got some absolutely stellar paintwork and color choice and composition. It's going to be very, very tricky because this is all very close. These last few have been insanely difficult to rank. So the model itself is obviously disgusting and very fitting of the category. There are some starey eyes on its pauldron, grotesque face, blemishes and rips and tears on its skin. It's really, really grotesque. Skulls and bits of corpses littering its base, and a kind of spooky, glowing, purpley blue sand timer illuminating everything from beneath. Very, very cool indeed. In terms of care and attention, there's even like really, really nice textures rendered on the inside edge of the pauldron, which, you know, is a pain to get to and, you know, shows the sort of dedication involved here. In terms of composition, I'm going to give this, you've guessed it, a 10. And I'm also going to give a 10 for execution because honestly, I can't fault it. The only place that's going to lose a single mark and hit a 9 is for palette. I think it's just a little bit too pale. I really appreciate having the color pop of having the sand timer there and the slightly red elements too, especially on the pauldron, but I feel like it's just a little bit too washed out and sort of simple in its color choice, especially for when we're nitpicking quite as much as I am now trying to determine a winner. And that is the end of that competition. I don't need these anymore because I'm not looking at any more amazing models, but if you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching till the end. I realise I've given 2 first places there, but to be honest, they both deserved it. I'll be very, very interested to see what the other judges choose is their favorite, because I found that incredibly difficult. Everything in that competition was insanely well painted, amazing models, very, very entertaining. I've thoroughly enjoyed looking at all of these amazing models. I hope you have too. Remember to check the link in the description if you want to grab one of those Black Metal Midwinter Minis t-shirts, and I hope to see you next time. Probably not wearing this ridiculous stuff though. I'll catch you then. Bye for now.